Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear colleagues and friends and also students here, thank you for coming to this special book forum. Our, of course, special guest, our own senior lecturer here and also researcher, of course, in Islamic studies, especially anthropology and history, Dr. Aryan Nakisa, whose books already came out actually 5 years ago, but it's okay because we are still need to learn about this book, The Anthropology of Islamic Law, Education, Ethics, and Legal Interpretation at Egypt's Al-Azhar. So because we have, started late, so without further ado, we are listening to Pak Arya's presentation for his own book.
Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the introduction. What is this book about? So the full title of the book is The Anthropology of Islamic Law, Education, Ethics, and Legal Interpretation at Egypt's Al-Azhar. And it's called the Anthropology of Islamic Law because it's an anthropological study, and so a good place to begin is to ask, what exactly is an anthropological study? What makes that different from a different type of study? Maybe a study in political science or a study from a text on history. Well, anthropologists are interested in studying different phenomena that you find in human societies, whether it be religion, marriage, business, art, and so on. However, there are different ways to study these things. Perhaps the most common way of studying them is just through reading texts. And so if you want to study, let's say, marriage in Indonesia, you would read texts on marriage in Indonesia. Maybe you read religious texts, maybe you read newspaper articles, maybe you read books that were written by the Dutch during the colonial period on marriage practices in Indonesia. So certainly using texts is one way to study a phenomenon, but another way to study it is through what is known as ethnographic fieldwork. So ethnographic fieldwork involves what is usually referred to as participant observation. So it basically means that if you want to learn about something like marriage in Indonesia or business in Indonesia or art in Indonesia, you have to visit some place, like in this case it would be Indonesia, and you have to learn the local language, and then you have to spend a long time, usually at least a year, observing the relevant phenomenon. So if you're studying, for instance, small business in Indonesia, you would go to Indonesia, you would learn the Indonesian language, and then you would go to visit businesses, or if you're studying Sufi tariqas, you would spend your time studying, visiting different scholars, different Sufi scholars, attending different events, interviewing people, and gradually getting to know about the phenomenon directly, rather than simply reading about it in a text. And you would go ahead and observe things, and you would make videos and take some photos, and then you would try and produce a work. You would try and produce research. You would try and produce a study based on what you have observed during your ethnographic field work. So what my study looked at was the most important center of Islamic learning and scholarship in the contemporary world, which is located in Cairo. So it consists of a network of interlinked institutions, Al-Azhar University, Cairo University's Darul Uloom, and then there are a lot of kind of traditional study circles that meet in places like smaller mosques or Sufi lodges that are connected to these institutions. But it's basically a network of institutions that you find in Cairo. So I refer to this overall site of Islamic learning as Al-Azhar, which is a bit of a simplification, but I just refer to it as Al-Azhar. And what one of the aims of my study was to provide the first comprehensive anthropological study of Al-Azhar. So basically I spent 3 years in Cairo. I was given permission to attend classes at Al-Azhar University. I attended this traditional study circles. I was able to attend classes at the Darul Uloom. I got to know the professors and the students and the institutions and the bureaucrats and examined the curriculum and attended various events. And then I just tried to provide a overview of what education is like at this institution. So that's kind of one way to understand the book, but the book was not just that. Another thing that I wanted to do is, beside providing the first comprehensive anthropological study of this very important site for Islamic learning, is I really wanted to see if it was possible to deepen our understanding of what was going on at this site by looking at some important theoretical frameworks. So within anthropology, within anthropology, there are different subfields. So some people will say, you know, I'm an anthropologist of law, or I'm an anthropologist of religion, or I'm an anthropologist of gender. There is a subfield within the anthropology of religion called the anthropology of Islam, which is a very important subfield. And that subfield has been deeply shaped by two theoretical frameworks. So usually when you go in and you study something, you know, on the one hand, the research that you're producing is based on what you're seeing, what you encounter in the field, but then there's the question of how do you analyze it? What frameworks do you use to analyze the material that you've come across? So within anthropology, there are two pretty important theoretical frameworks, or the two most important theoretical frameworks. One is referred to as hermeneutic theory, and it's closely associated with one of the most famous anthropologists. His name is Clifford Geertz. So he wrote a bunch of studies on Islam in Indonesia and Morocco between the 1970s and the 1990s. And his work, which used hermeneutic theory, really shaped the anthropological study of Islam. And then there's another figure. His name is Talal Asad, and he used a different theoretical framework that is often referred to as practice theory, and that has really shaped the study of Muslim societies, or the anthropology of Islam, since the 1990s. So ordinarily, people think of these two frameworks as opposed to one another. I find value in both of these frameworks, and I thought perhaps there would be a way to integrate them, and maybe integrate them using some insights that have come out in maybe some more recent scholarship on hermeneutics. So that is going to be difficult to appreciate in the abstract. So rather than continuing on with just speaking about hermeneutic theory and practice theory in very abstract terms, let me provide a little bit more explanation with some concrete examples so you kind of understand how these theoretical frameworks operate. And I will primarily, just due to limits in time, I'll primarily focus on the hermeneutic theory element, or the hermeneutic theory component. So hermeneutic theory is really interested in how we acquire knowledge of other people's minds. And people across the world conceptualize minds in a particular way. So whenever we think of minds, we think, well, in a person's mind, there are their beliefs, desires, intentions, and emotions. But we distinguish pretty strongly between someone's mind and someone's body. So a body is visible. You can see someone's arms, you can see someone's head, you can see someone's legs. But a mind is invisible, so you can't directly look into someone's mind. So you can see my hand very easily, but you can't see what I desire, what I believe, what I intend, and what my emotions are. You can't see into my mind. So that's kind of the challenge that all human beings, that confront all human beings. On the one hand, they're very interested in what is going on in people's minds, what their intentions or beliefs or desires are. And on the other hand, these minds are hidden from them. And just to give you a sense of where I'm going with this, or where many people have gone with this. Oftentimes, rules, including the rules of the Sharia, are seen as intentions. They're seen as, God has particular desires, he has particular maqasid, and he intends that you do this or intends that you do that. That is his qasd, that is his maqsad. So you could think of, many times people will say the Sharia is the will of God. So will is another name for intention. But it's a challenge because to understand the mind of any individual, including the mind of God, there are certain processes that would be used, and those processes are examined by scholars who are interested in hermeneutic theory. So even though the mind of any person is hidden, you can't see into it, it nevertheless causes certain effects, certain perceptible effects in the world. And by looking at those effects, you can gain knowledge, you can infer knowledge about the mind. So these effects that are produced by the mind can be seen as evidence or signs of what is in the mind. And these effects that are caused by the mind take countless forms, including actions, statements, and artifacts. So for instance, you might have a woman and her belief that it will rain causes her to perform the action of picking up an umbrella. So you might not know, or her desire to play tennis may cause her to state, "Bring me the tennis racket." Or her intention to celebrate a wedding may cause her to bake a wedding cake, which is an artifact. Or her emotion of anger might cause her to kick a television. These are effects caused by this woman's mind, and they serve as evidence or signs of what is found in that mind. By examining this type of evidence, we can acquire knowledge of someone's mind. So for instance, we can look at the fact that someone has taken the action of picking up an umbrella. We say the fact that you picked up an umbrella, that action is evidence that you believe that it will rain. The fact that you say, your statement, "Bring me my tennis racket," that is evidence that a person desires to play tennis. Or if we see a wedding cake in someone's kitchen, we can say that is evidence that they intend to celebrate a wedding. So within the context of hermeneutic theory, you'll come across a term known as mind reading, and that is a term used to describe the process of inferring knowledge of someone else's mind from the effects caused by that mind. So basically, when you look at someone's actions, when you look at someone's statements, when you look at artifacts that they've produced, that is evidence of what is in their mind. So I argue that there's a distinctive form of mind reading found in the Islamic legal tradition encompassing fiqh and usul al-fiqh, and it focuses on extracting legal knowledge from texts and embodied practices. So in certain cases, we can say that, and in order to appreciate how this is and how this process works, I look at some research on hermeneutic theory that points out that oftentimes it's not just individuals that have intentions, but groups of people. So it's not just individuals who have intentions and beliefs and desires. It can be entire groups of people who have intentions and beliefs and desires. So the process of mind reading isn't necessarily just focusing on figuring out what is in one individual's mind, but it can be based on what is shared by an entire group. So oftentimes when you have some kind of authority, some kind of king, or some kind of maybe owner of a business, that king or that owner of a business will have certain intentions and beliefs and desires which come to be shared by all of the people who are under that person's authority. So for instance, you might say that there is a restaurant owner, and that restaurant owner forms certain intentions. So for instance, she forms an intention that her workers make apple pies. So she says, it's my intention that all of you make apple pies, and she communicates that to the workers. And that's based on certain beliefs and desires. So she believes that it is So she desires to sell apple pies, and she believes that the customers will make she believes that customers will buy these apple pies. So basically, when you look at the actions of the workers, when you look at all of the action, so it's not just if you see this woman making apple pies, you might say, okay, she has a desire to sell apple pies. She believes that people will buy these apple pies. But also, if you look at all of the workers, she will say, okay, I have a plan. My intention is to sell these apple pies. And when you look at all the workers making the apple pies, you can say that they have adopted this same intention. And when you look at their behavior, you can actually infer something about not only their minds, but the mind of the person that they are obeying. So to give you an example, imagine that you have a king or a god that says something like the following. My intention, my will, is that everyone refrain from drunk driving. No one should drive when they're drunk. From that statement, it is possible to infer things. So it is possible to say if the king says don't drive when you're drunk, you can infer certain things about his desires, like maybe he desires to prevent traffic accidents. Maybe he believes that being intoxicated causes people to get into those types of accidents. And this applies when we are thinking of so it could be a human king, it could also be a divine king. So in Islam, it is widely believed that God has a will, or God has particular intentions. And these intentions we tend to equate them with the Sharia rules. And these Sharia rules are based on certain desires that God has, and also based on certain beliefs or true beliefs that God has. So Muslim religious scholars hold that God is a beneficent being, Ar-Rahman, who has a desire, a gharad, to secure certain benefits, jalb al-maslaha, for human beings, and he lays down certain rules or ahkam for this purpose. So we could say that, there's a benefit that God desires for human beings, which maybe one such benefit is the protection of their lives, which is hifth al-nufus, or the protection of their wealth, hifth al-amwal. So because God desires to protect lives and property rights, he has laid down rules punishing murder and theft. And this is kind of a standard perspective, maqasid al-sharia, that you find in Islamic law. So generally Muslim jurists will say that each of the laws of God represent his intentions or his will. And on top of that, not only do these laws represent God's intention or will. So for instance, God has a law which says, pray 5 times a day or amputate the hand of the thief. What that means is that God intends the Muslim people to pray 5 times a day, or God intends Muslims to amputate the hand of the thief. But each of these, whenever you talk about a human intention, every intention is usually based on a belief and a desire. So you would say that if God says, my intention is that you punish human beings for theft by amputating their hands, there is a desire underlying that, which is to protect hifth al-mal. And moreover, there is a belief underlying that, a true belief, which is that if you amputate people's hands, it will deter them from stealing. Otherwise, the rule wouldn't make sense. So you can say that each of the rules of the Sharia is like an intention that God has for human beings acting in a particular way. And each of those intentions is tied to a particular desire. God has a particular maslahah that he desires to achieve. And moreover, each rule in the Sharia is based on particular beliefs about the world, or in the case of Islam, we would say knowledge about the world. The knowledge is like a true belief. So when Muslims talk about understanding the Sharia, what they're really interested in is understanding all of God's intentions and all of the beliefs and all of the desires that are under those that undergird those intentions. So really, the process of the Sharia is trying to understand what is in God's mind. So it's trying to understanding the Sharia. Understanding all of the rules of the Sharia means understanding each rule is a intention that God has, and each intention is based on a belief and a desire. So that's a particular way of understanding what is going on with the Sharia. But I think that this is reflected in the Muslim jurisprudence. So for instance, when Muslim jurists study different texts, they don't simply look at the wording of the text, they don't simply look at the zahir of the text. Their question is always, what does God intend? What is the rule that God intends? So with respect to any Sharia rule, like, cut off the hand of the thief, that is, it is God's intentions that Muslims punish theft by cutting off the hand of the thief, and that is because God has a desire, which is hifth al-mal, to protect people's property, and moreover, that is based on particular beliefs about the world, namely that amputation deters theft. If an amputation penalty encouraged theft, it would the law would not work in that way. So, one thing that you have is when people study the Sharia. So my argument is that when people study the Sharia, really they're trying to understand the hidden mind of God. And in certain cases, they can study the hidden mind of God by looking at actual statements that have been made by God. So for instance, when we have a collection of such statements in the Quran, God will say things like amputate the hand of the thief. And when we read a verse of that type, that tells us something about God's mind. When it says, amputate the hand of the thief, it means God intends Muslims to punish theft by amputating the hand of the thief, and that's because God has once again, aim of protecting property, and it's based on a belief that amputation will deter theft. Now, none of that is actually spelled out in the Quran itself. So the Quran doesn't say, God has these, or the Quran doesn't necessarily say that God's intention is tied to a particular desire and a particular set of beliefs. And oftentimes Muslim jurists themselves don't explain these things either. However, one of the things that I argue in my book is that this is unconscious, that this is kind of an unconscious approach to interpreting the mind of God. And it's not something which is at all strange, because as many theorists who are working in hermeneutic theory will say, they will say this is kind of a universal approach that human beings take towards interpreting texts or interpreting anyone's intentions. Whenever anyone the whole process of interpretation is basically trying to find out what is in someone's mind. So trying to find out their intentions and how those intentions are linked to particular beliefs and desires. But so one type of evidence, one sign that we have of what is in God's mind is his statements that are collected in the Quran. But I argue that Muslim scholars look at other sources of evidence as well when they're trying to figure out what is in God's mind. So one of the things that I say is, just as the soldiers of a general, when they're executing his plans, they do so based on his intentions, they follow his intentions, or the people who are working at a business, they follow the plans and the intentions of their boss. I say that Muslim religious scholars act in accordance with the intention of God. Ideally, they see themselves as servants of God, and they act based on God's intentions. And when they say something, so for instance, all Muslims, ideally, when they are talking about the Islamic religion, they should not speak on the basis of just on the basis of whim. What they should do is their sayings and their actions should be based on the intentions of God. So I say that this is first and foremost true when it comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I say that the Prophet's actions and statements are based on the intention of God. And if you study his actions and statements, that is how Muslims seek to acquire knowledge about God's intentions. So for instance, if you have a situation where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam goes into Mecca and he destroys the idols that are found in Mecca, this tells us something about God's mind. It tells us first and foremost that it is God's intention that Muslims remove idols from Mecca. Okay, first and foremost, when we look at the Prophet ﷺ's actions, when we look at his sunnah more generally, this tells us something about God's intentions. It also tells us something about God's desires and the beliefs that are underlying particular rules. So, for instance, presumably, it is believed that the reason why these idols are being destroyed is it is believed that if idols are present, then that is going to cause people to worship idols. And God also has a desire that people not worship idols. So, yes. So so we can see from the Prophet ﷺ's actions, from his sunnah, that God intends to remove idols from Mecca, and that is because God desires that people do not worship idols, but rather exclusively worship him, that they don't engage in shirk. And moreover, this is based on a belief, on a true belief by God, that when you have idols in Mecca, or in other places, it will encourage people to engage in shirk or idol worship. So notice that here we have a situation where we're looking at the actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but what we're really doing is tacitly inferring things about God's mind, about God's intentions and desired ends or maqasid, and so on. Then I take another step and I say, beyond just the statements of God that we find in the Quran. Yeah, the statements of God that we find in the Quran, that is one source of Islamic law. And because Islamic law is nothing other than understanding God's mind, so the Quran is one form of evidence that we use to understand what's in God's mind. The actions of the Prophet ﷺ is another evidence, is another source. It's another asl from usul fiqh that we try to use to understand the Sharia, which is what is in God's mind. But not only the Prophet ﷺ, but in fact all of the Muslim scholars, especially those scholars who are most knowledgeable and most obedient, their actions provide evidence of what is in God's mind, what God's intentions are. So, for instance, ideally, the Salaf, looking at the actions and the statements of the Salaf, it is believed that the actions and the statements of the Salaf weren't based on whim, but rather they were based on, they were following God's intention. So hence, if you listen to the statements of the Salaf and you observe their actions, this tells us about the intentions of God and his desires and the beliefs that underlie Islamic law. Now, those statements are in certain cases, in many cases, they are collected together in books, and Muslims study those books. Some of these are books, books that contain the statements of the Salaf, but then there are also books that are written by the Salaf or individuals who lived slightly after the time of the Salaf, like the four Imams, and Muslims study their books. And that's another way to understand what is in the mind of God. But it's not only dead scholars that Muslims seek to study. Ideally, it is also living scholars. In pre-modern Islamic law, it was conceived of as highly problematic to study one's religion, to study the Sharia simply from books. Rather, the idea is that you would study, so theoretically, you would study not only the statements of God in the Quran, not only the statement and actions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as found in the hadith, not only the actions and the statements of past Muslim scholars like Abu Hanifa as described in books from the past, but you would actually look at living exemplars as well. And when you would see these living exemplars do certain things. So for instance, maybe you have a sheikh and that sheikh never smokes, or even when someone offers him a cigarette, he doesn't smoke the cigarette. You would say, possibly, well, the sheikh that I'm looking at, his behavior indicates he is not behaving simply on the basis of his whims. He is acting in accordance with what he understands to be the intentions of God. So when you see him not refusing to smoke cigarettes, you would say, okay, on the basis of what I've seen from my sheikh, it is God's intention that Muslims refrain from smoking cigarettes, and that is because God maybe has a desire to protect human health, and maybe that is because God entertains the true belief that smoking cigarettes causes problems to your health. So I talk about how in traditional forms of Islamic education, when people are trying to understand the Sharia, which is the mind of God, which is the interlinked intentions, beliefs, and desires of God, they're not just in a traditional context. They're not just looking at the texts such as the Quran and the Hadith and the statements of past scholars. They're also looking at contemporary living scholars, and that's tied to particular pedagogical practices. So there's a pedagogical practice known as suhba, or companionship, where people will go ahead and spend many years in the company of a sheikh, and they will try and look at his adab and his akhlaq and his behavior, and try to learn the Sharia in part from what they see from that living exemplar. Now, one of the things is those type of practices are found at Al-Azhar, although they are marginal. So one of the other things that I talk about in my book is how over the course of the modern period, that type of learning has been replaced by a different set of learning, a type of learning which has a different understanding of how Muslims should acquire knowledge of the Sharia, how they should acquire knowledge of God's mind, which involves not, for instance, forming a personal bond of companionship with a sheikh and praying with him and attending his study circles and, traveling around with him for 10 or 20 years. Rather, the primary way that you would come to an understanding of the Sharia is simply by studying legal texts. So I talk about how Al-Azhar has been gradually transformed since the late 19th century, in keeping with new assumptions about how people should try and acquire understanding of the Sharia, or try and acquire understanding of God's mind. So that's kind of the hermeneutic component. The hermeneutic component is basically how we can look at things like people's actions or statements, and from them infer knowledge of people's minds. Practice theory, I'll just say a couple words about it just because we don't have as much time. But practice theory is, whereas hermeneutic theory is about looking at people's actions and statements and inferring things about their minds, practice theory is different. Practice theory is about how, if you continuously practice certain actions or say certain statements, it can transform your mind. So it's kind of looking at that process. So it's looking at, for instance, a lot of it builds on notions of ethics, especially Aristotelian ethics. And the idea is that there are particular statements or actions or patterns of behavior. And if someone, for instance, performs an action over and over again, like if they perform acts of generosity, like let's say zakat, that can transform them. So if you practice zakat, it can teach you to feel emotions of love for the poor. It can teach you to, desire to give to the poor and give you a new character trait, which is a generosity. if you continuously do something like pray. But basically, the underlying idea is that if every aspect of your mind is tied to a pattern of behavior, and if you mimic the pattern of behavior, it will transform your mind. So so belief in God is tied to a pattern of behavior which involves, let's say, praying. So if you want to go ahead and acquire deeper belief in God, deeper iman, you can constantly practice this action of prayer. If you want to become a generous person, you can practice the action of generosity. If you want to become a courageous person, you should do courageous things like, fight on the battlefield. So I talk also about how this particular approach, so this is associated with ethics, or akhlaq as an element of Islamic education. And I talk about how it was integrated into kind of pre-modern forms of Muslim learning. I talk about how certain forms of this type of education can be found at the margins of Al-Azhar to today, but also how one of the things that we see since the 19th century in the transformation of Al-Azhar is less of a focus on ethical upbringing or transforming the hearts and minds, the qalb of students, and more on a type of a model of learning which is more bureaucratic, more impersonal, more about just conveying a particular set of skills and so on. So this is just a very quick summary of some of the themes that are found in the book. I hope this is sufficient.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arya Nakisa, for very, I think, fantastic ideas about the complex relationship between the hermeneutic theory and also practice theory regarding the learning of Islamic legal tradition in Al-Azhar and some of other institutions in Cairo, Egypt. Of course, I think we have some question in our minds, including, for instance, how if we look at the different interpretation of Sharia according to different scholars and also different practice as well, whether this also related to God intention or not. But I think also probably also relation between, practice in Islamic learning with the habitus theory of Bourdieu, for instance. But I think I will have to, ask audience for asking some question first. If you have not yet, probably maybe some my two basic questions that I posted to you. Oh.
Thank you very much, Professor Nakisa. My name is Sonia. I am from the Faculty of Social Sciences. My question regarding the method, how is it that if the evidence, we know one's intention from the evidence, but sometimes what we intended doesn't result in the consequence that we want. So if we just measure it from the evidence that is not intended by the doer, how the anthropology explain it. And my second question, if you may make it easy for me, what is the research question of your book and the main argument from you? Thank you very much.
It's a little bit unclear. What was the second question?
The research question of your book and the main argument. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just try and sum up then. So in terms of my primary argument, my primary argument was that Islamic texts and interpretation and educational methods that are characteristic of Islamic education can be understood as a set of procedures for trying to understand the hidden mind of God, to understand God's intentions and how they're related to particular desires and beliefs, and that this, and kind of describing this process and that we can analyze the history of education at Al-Azhar with reference to this idea. So that is kind of kind of a simple, short way of putting it. In terms of the other question that you asked, which is that when people do an action, when you see someone do an action externally, that is consistent with any number of intentions or desires. So for instance, you might have a situation where someone is walking towards a pizza restaurant, and then you can say, is their intention to eat the pizza at the restaurant, or is their intention to kill the cashier who's working at that restaurant? There are a variety of different ways of interpreting that person's actions. And this is a very important idea of interpretation, the actions as symbols, the fact that there are always kind of certain disagreements about whenever you look at someone's actions or statements, there's always room for interpretation. There's always room for a variety of views. So first of all, in terms of finding out with absolute precision what people's intentions are, I think there are always going to be some amount of disagreements. I even think that when it comes to Islamic law, there are disagreements about what exactly God's intentions are, and we see that with respect. One way that is manifested is in the fact that you have 4 different legal schools, which will say, maybe one legal school will say, well, you know, when we pray, it was God's intention that we place our hands on our chests. And then someone will say, no, it's God's intentions that we place our hand maybe dangling at our side. That might vary from madhab to madhab. However, generally speaking, one way to gather more knowledge about someone's intentions is to look at not just one action, but multiple actions. So for instance, maybe if I just see someone walking in the direction of a pizza restaurant, I'm not sure whether their intention is to buy pizza or their intention is to kill the cashier at the restaurant. But if the person walks in the direction of the restaurant and then their next action is to take out a gun, or they make a statement like, I hate you, well, you know, why did you divorce my parents, or they start saying things like that, then when you look at all of the different evidence, the more evidence that you have, the more that you can speak precisely about people's intentions. That's one of the reasons why I think that the actions of living religious scholars, one of the reasons why they had significance in traditional forms of Islamic education is that people take those as additional evidence. So for instance, when I'm trying to figure out what God's intentions are, yes, I look at the Quran, yes, I look at the Hadith, but I also have to look at the actions of Muslim scholars from the past and into the present to understand what those intentions are and how they apply today.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I would like to ask about the ethics in Islamic law. How do we have to put our ethics in Islamic law? Because we all know that Sharia provides a set of law, but and also the majority Muslim countries apply the Sharia as part of their legal codes. But there is a case in Germany when they have refugees from majority Muslim countries, let's say Middle Eastern, they accept the refugees from them, and there was an increasing number of criminal rape, while in fact in their countries, in their own countries, as a Muslim majority countries, they fully applied the Sharia as the legal code, and they can still run. I mean, they still obey the Sharia, but when they got the freedom
they use that freedom to legitimate their actions. So how do we put the ethics in Islamic law? How is the place of the ethics in Islamic law, actually? Thank you.
Wait, so the bad behavior was in their own countries or when they went out of the countries?
The bad action, you mean in Germany? In Germany.
Oh, in
So
Germany.
in Germany. So when they accept more refugees from Middle Eastern, they got increasing number of criminal rape. Yeah, but before they don't have that case before the coming of refugees.
Okay, so
How do you think?
it's an interesting question, but so a couple of things to keep in mind is if we look statistically, things like levels of violent crime are tied to a variety of different factors. One of them is, religious teachings or level of adherence to religious teachings. But other things are like, for instance, level of surveillance, amount of police that you have in the country, level of poverty. All of these things are statistically correlated. In fact, when it comes to Muslim countries, the levels of violent crime measured by homicide or rape, and I would encourage you to actually look at this yourself, are actually lower than once you control for levels of wealth and economic development, they are lower. So if you want to look at, let's say, violent crime, including homicide, rape, robbery, you compare, let's say, the countries, Muslim countries, so let's say countries in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa or other regions, the Muslim countries actually have a lower rate, and it could be argued, many people would argue that that is partially due to these Islamic teachings. Also, when someone talks about who is migrating to specific countries, oftentimes there are particular migration patterns. Sometimes you have a situation where poor elements or elements of a society that maybe have a criminal background could be statistically more likely to migrate. Beyond that, this is also something which is important when we look at crime statistics, is sometimes ethics or sometimes various forms of criminal behavior are tied to testosterone levels. So testosterone is a hormone that makes people aggressive. For instance, if you go to any country, including Indonesia, you'll notice something about the people in jail, which is that there are a lot of men and there are very few women. That's because testosterone leads to aggression, and aggression can, that type of aggression, that kind of competitiveness can be good, but it also causes higher levels of crime. Moreover, testosterone levels shift depending on one's age. So for instance, younger people, younger men commit higher levels of crime than older men. Now, I'm not going to go into details, but levels of testosterone also highly vary among populations in the world in ways that don't correlate with religion. So you could have a situation. If you want to get a hint of what testosterone is linked to, look at things like how much facial hair you have, what your height is. When you have populations that have lower levels of testosterone, they have lower crime rates generally. And moreover, depending on your social practices, you can have higher or lower levels of testosterone, which then affect the crime rate. So